All right, this is the second essay. All right, so this is going to review part two essay assessment. So for this section, you will write about your experience engaging with your peers' essay. Please address the points below in complete sentences and paragraphs. All right. So the first thing that you're going to do is to establish the overall essay. All right. Was the essay informative, persuasive, right? Or was it challenging to figure out what was the overall objective or purpose of the essay that I assigned to you a couple of weeks ago? All right. So then you have to look at the like the logical consistency, and this is sort of going back, and I don't necessarily mean to cause any trauma if you had experienced this trauma in an introductory English course about ethos, logos, and pathos. So then for this section or this particular point, sorry about that, um, is that you're looking at the ethos, and the ethos in writing is just establishing if the writer is like reliable, sort of presents their ideas competently and honestly to their audience, and not necessarily deceive, but you need to be cautious, right? Because if you're assuming that the writer that I assigned to you might be deceptive, may not necessarily that that was their intent. It's just because of and and I know this is going to sound terrible and elitist, because it's the quality of the writing, right? Because poor writing skills can lead to misunderstandings, right? Even though that a person or the person who's writing that particular essay had no original intent to deceive the writer, but just because of the not understanding how to properly use like punctuation, word order, verb tense agreements, building independent clauses, dependent clauses, and all these other things that you have to sort of keep in mind as you write, may appear that they're being deceptive or unfair, right? But when you make a certain claim, you need to be able to find direct, specific evidence from the text itself, right? That's why you need to use the essay that you submitted to me, and which I've been going over this weekend, to be able to do that. Okay, because if you notice my comments come directly from what I see in your paper. That is what you're going to do here as well. All right, so the essay is your empirical evidence. Okay, all right. Now, point number two. Please determine if the essay was well organized. This is like the logos. Okay, is there logic? Oops, just realized I wrote used the wrong there. Sorry about that. Is there logic in their is there logic in how the writer organized the manuscript? Meaning, is an example of a logical format, which is A plus B equals C. This is called like um, a linear model of thinking where A plus B equals C. There are other types of writing and thinking, and the one that I sort of engage in a little more is called dialectical thinking and dialectical writing, where which is can be identified to Karl Marx, but also could be identified going back to Aristotle. Okay, so it's a very old method of thinking, and of course it's been developed and improved over philosophical debates and whatnot. But I won't necessarily bore you with all that information. Okay. But then you'll continue. Is there evidence from the manuscript that the writer presented a thesis statement or a question guiding the direction of their manuscript? So then this sort of helps you as the writer. If the writer of the assignment I assigned to you a couple of weeks ago is able to do that, right? Because if a writer does that, it makes reading the essay a little bit easier because that's what you're going to be looking for as you go through the manuscript itself. All right. And then you're also going to be considering, does the manuscript effectively use sources used in the manuscript? For example, Ian, I'm not sure why this happened, but all this should be under C. Okay. So does the writer identifies the sources used? Does identify the author, and do they also include the year of publication? Okay. So you want to make sure you have that. Sorry. Um, do they contextualize the source they are using in their manuscript? And what I mean by contextualize means this: does the author of the assigned manuscript, when they use a source in their paper, do they explain why that source is relevant to what they're going to talk about? Do they briefly summarize the section or the portion of the manuscript that they're going to use and how it's relatable to their idea? And then they're integrating it into the overall essay, the body essay that you are writing, or what they're writing about the sources that they use, right? Does it, hopefully that makes sense? Okay, because you always have to provide context, right? Just like when I mentioned, or sorry, when I had you do the exercise on how to describe the color black to a blind person, one of the major comments that I made in a lot of those brief paragraphs is the perspective of describing the color blind to a blind person from the perspective with the person who has sight, or does it come from the perspective of the person who lacks sight, right? Because by indicating the perspective, you're contextualizing which experience you are highlighting, right? Does that, if that makes sense? So you're going to be do the same, you're going to be doing this a similar evaluation of the source in relationship how it's being integrated and assimilated into the body of the assigned writer's essay. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Now, point number three: do they properly cite the quote, or paraphrase the source they use? Right. And the reason why um, I indicate this, because you always have to include the page number, because if there is a question of the sentence or the paragraph or whatever things that are taken out of the source itself, and if there's a question in terms of how it is interpreted or how it's used or how it's presented, the person who's reading it can go back to the original text and find that same quote and make sure that the context is not, or the quote, or the quote is not taken out of context or is not manipulated from the intent of the author who wrote those lines. That's why it's always important to include the page number. Because if you notice, for the ones that I've done that I've already graded, I've commented that it's lacking page numbers. So then I go to the manuscript that I assign and I look for the quote and I say, oh, I found this on page 6 or page 5 or page 4. Excuse me, of the man. Excuse me, of the manuscript. All right. Now, and then the next point is, do they properly set the page number? Excuse me. Well, but that's sort of what I will explain. And then point number 5, do they explain how the quote relates to their thesis, argument, or question that they're addressing? Excuse me. All right. So then this is also going back to the idea of contextualization. Because when you provide a quote, excuse me, you have to explain why the quote is relevant. And then you have to interpret what the quote means and then connect the interpretation of the quote to your ideas that are contained in the manuscript that you're writing. And that is the process of how you are able to integrate and write a cohesive argument, that and sorry, a cohesive argument that allows the reader to understand what you're trying to convey to them based on whatever topic. All right. Because technically, um, these points should actually go under here, under C. Right. Yeah. So these points should actually go under C. I don't know what happened with the formatting, and I apologize for that. Right. Because that's why it's always important to edit. Okay. So I will fix this to make sure that it's consistent in terms of the logic that I wrote here under this section. Okay. So I'm going to stop it here, and then I'm going to go to part 3, evaluating the editing process.